Hi everyone, another day, another budget retro gaming handheld review, with this one being the M17. There doesn't seem to be any one brand associated with the M17 except for the SG GAM sticker on the top left of the box, and it's simply referred to online as the M17. The M17 intrigued me with its Retroid Pocket 3-like design and its claim to support up to PSP games, although it will come as no surprise that all but the lightest of PSP games actually play well. The M17 can be found as low as $30 though, when using coupons and promotions, so for the right circumstances it may prove a bargain to some. In terms of specs, the M17 has a 4.3 inch 480 by 272 pixels LCD display, 256 megabytes of RAM, a 2000 mAh battery which seems to last around 2ish hours, and a Cortex A7 CPU inside. It runs on what seems to be a heavily modified variation of emuelec, which although is stripped of all but its most basic features, still at the very least has a great theme throughout. Straight out of the box, the M17 isn't that bad all things considered. It feels very light with it only weighing in at around 300 odd grams, and it being a pretty solid shell with no rattles. The joysticks don't click in, and the huge M17 text in the bottom right of the screen distracts away from what otherwise isn't a bad shell design, especially for a budget handheld. The shell is pretty much input free except from the top, so it's smooth on the sides and underside, with only the gaps for its mono speaker on the back. The clean setup makes the M17 print on the front even more of a distraction, but overall it's not too bad. On top, we've got the USB-C input for charging, a headphone jack, micro SD card slot, and a power slider, as well as stacked shoulder buttons. The volume buttons are two dedicated buttons towards the top of the screen, and otherwise we just have the standard face button controls. So, moving on to the controls, the M17 overall isn't too bad here either. There's certainly room for improvement, especially around the accuracy of the dpad, but as an overall package it's certainly better than some of the budget no-brand handhelds I've reviewed on the channel before. The buttons are a little compact and struggle by going into the shell with harsh presses, but they spring back quite quickly and feel soft enough not to cause any fatigue if you do button mash, although this is where the vast majority of inaccuracies do come from. The shoulder buttons are actually good, with the L1 and R1 buttons being very responsive throughout their whole length, and the back shoulder buttons being very easy to press with a satisfying click when you do. There's no analog input of course, but there's not too much use for it in terms of what the M17 can play well anyway. It may well just be a consequence of the M17 shell being so heavily influenced by the Retroid Pocket 3s, but I was genuinely surprised by the shoulder buttons, as normally these flicked stack design with budget handhelds never seem to sit or feel right. The D-pad is functional, which is a bit of a shame as it does end up letting the rest of the controls down a bit. It's thin but very soft, which mixed with its very undefined pivot means that it's not very accurate at all. It's certainly functional and plays well in the vast majority of games, but pulling off any form of multi-combination, especially quickly, is incredibly difficult to do. The joysticks don't click in and they have limited travel, especially in the diagonals, but they do function fine, and the odd PS1 game I did play using them weren't too bad of an experience. I wouldn't have thought that the joysticks would have translated well to modern gaming in the slightest, but for what the M17 can play, it does manage to handle. In terms of firmware, the M17 seemingly sports a very stripped down version of emuelec's emulation station, but it is very limited. There's no access to any of emuelec's settings or its themes or anything like that. You can't seem to access RetroArch or change any of the settings or screen resolutions. There is a tiny quick menu that you can get to in-game, but you can only save or load state, and that's state singular with just one save state slot per game. It's a bit of a bizarre setup, but even with these limitations, it does end up better than the vast majority of budget handhelds OSs out there, and the emulators picked up do seem pretty fine-tuned. The main areas that the M17 has issues with are with anything 3D intensive, so Nintendo 64, certainly PSP, and some of the PS1 catalogue. From what I've played below that, it wasn't too bad of an experience. Anyway, I'll cut to some gameplay footage now and summarise back up at the end. So overall, the M17 isn't a bad budget handheld. If you can find it at the right price, it's one of those entry handhelds which is great to gift to friends to see if they will like retro gaming, or just to have around for your kids or their friends to play on without the worry of them breaking anything. Its loose dpad, limited firmware and mono sound stop it from taking the budget crown and getting a firm recommendation for those wanting more than just to dip their toe into retro gaming on a handheld, but it's still not a bad option at all. That's it for now though, thanks so much for watching.